In a world where even the smallest disagreements can lead to arguments, violence, and even death, two brothers tackle the difficult subjects. This podcast is not just about dissecting topics from two different perspectives. It's also about how to have conversations on difficult topics while avoiding the urge to tear someone's head off and vomit down the bloody stump of their neck.
So this conversation, I don't know. I guess I don't know how you would categorize it. I guess my feeling is it's my original thought was what constitutes a media outlet. I don't know if you have a different way of framing the question or if your research took you in a different direction.
No, I think that's a good one. I think when we look at it's almost a derogatory term now to say mainstream media, but the mainstream media, if we define that as the cable news outlets like CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and I would say even New York, outside of the cable news networks like the newspapers and things, or online like the New York Times, Washington Post, those places, if we consider that the mainstream media, there does seem to be a group of people that are providing news or newsworthy things to the general public that is coming from a completely different source. And they probably, in a lot of ways, some of them consider themselves journalists, but some of them just consider themselves bloggers or podcasters, but they are providing news and people are consuming the news that they're providing.
Yeah, I'd say that's fairly accurate. And when we talk about the mainstream media or the general news outlets, I would also include local newspapers, local news, the broadcast network like NBC, ABC. But I still, your basic categorization, I'd say, is fairly accurate. Now, I think that we should probably also not just look at mainstream versus non-mainstream media, but the way in which information is presented and what the presenter's intention is. And much of this conversation originated from what we were talking about with Joe Rogan. And of course, I don't want to make it Joe Rogan specific, but I think he is illustrative of this new media potentiality, I guess you could say. The format of essentially interviewing someone, of course, is not new. The format of the presenting of information, the format of the content, which I would say the podcast, the blogs, that one is fairly new. But we've always had, well, I don't know, maybe. So I know that you're a big reader of history, Colin, and I believe that we were listening to the audiobook of Alexander Hamilton because of your recommendation. And one of the things that I found very interesting about that, not just about him and his life and the origins of the country, but the way that they would communicate with each other, that they were often printing out pamphlets and sharing this information. And of course, I don't really understand entirely, but my based on that, on what I was reading, it sounded like the equivalent of a blog, where an individual has an opinion. That individual might have a little bit of reach, maybe locally, maybe within all 13 colonies. And so he'd print out this pamphlet, and then you would go out and you would buy his opinion piece. It might be very well researched. It might be entirely opinionated and conspiratorial, but it was a way for an individual to reach a larger audience, and with more content than he would through, say, an editorial in the local newspaper. And I feel like that's similar to what we're seeing now with blogs and podcasts.
Yeah, you know what else? I hadn't thought of that, but what else is similar is it seems like at times some of those men back then would do other things where they would print under an assumed name.
Yeah.
And it doesn't happen quite as much anymore, but it seemed like for a while on Twitter and other places, people would have these kind of ghost accounts where they could say different things. They could present their opinion, but it wouldn't affect their electoral standing, I guess.
Yeah.
Where they wouldn't, hurt their chances of being elected because it didn't come back to them, but they could get their opinions out there. And I think that happened as well. Yeah, I think that type of stuff was definitely happening back then. And I wonder even in the mid 1900s if people weren't doing something similar. Well, and another thing that they've been doing for hundreds of years is, strategically leaking things to certain journalists. And so if you want information to get out, maybe you leak something bad about your opponent, maybe you leak something good about you or about something that you're, some legislation that you're proposing. So yeah, I think all this stuff has been happening, but yeah, as you said, the format has changed a little bit, where we have this platform where we can do different things. One of those, I was doing a little bit of research on the reach of all these different mediums or media, but it sounded like the cable news networks. I think CNN is less than 1 million people. It's like 750,000 people watch their show typically.
Really? Huh.
Yeah. And MSNBC, slightly over 1 million. Fox News, the biggest, we act like it's the biggest, but it's like 1.7 million. But when you look at, for example, I was listening to a Freakonomics podcast talking about some of these issues, and their typical podcasts, and they're not a huge podcast, but they reach over 1 million people on each podcast. I don't know if you can hear that. I'm going to shut my door open.
I guess the kids are up.
They are going to get it. Oh my God. They don't know what's coming. And then, Joe Rogan, I think he has like 11 million listeners. I mean, he just dwarfs them.
Yeah.
So, but when you talk about then Facebook, and a lot of people, and we talk about getting their news from it. I wouldn't even, I would think a lot of people would not consider themselves getting their news from Joe Rogan, but they are, or not consider getting their news from Facebook, but they are. They don't go to Facebook looking for news, but news pops up in their feed and they like it or dislike it, or they read it, or at least they see the headlines, but Facebook dwarfs all of them.
Right.
So yeah, these social media platforms are huge providers of news and information. Even The Daily Show. I mean, Jon Stewart, people wouldn't say, well, I'm going to Jon Stewart to get my news, but he was talking about current events, and he was questioning politicians and pointing out hypocrisies and in the things that they were doing. Like, people are getting their news from these sources.
Yeah. And one of the challenges is the philosophy of the show or the intent of the owner, in this case, whether Joe Rogan or whatever. And I think it's also helpful to look at comparisons. And Joe Rogan or anybody else, whether you're talking Sam Harris, Ben Shapiro, any of these other people that are putting out their podcasts, and it's an interview format. It's a lot of those people have a very broad spectrum that they're interested in presenting information on. And the criteria tends to be, what are they interested in? Or who are they interested in? And in some ways, I would compare it to, let's say, a Larry King, who did essentially the same thing. He just interviewed people. That's all he did on cable news. He was interviewing people. And he interviewed all different types of people. He interviewed, the people on the political spectrum. He interviewed scientists, entertainers. And I feel like that is very similar to what Joe Rogan is doing. Some of these other people tend to specialize a little bit, but Joe Rogan is all over the place. And there's nothing wrong with that, of course. And, it's his show. He can do what he wants. But you compare that to, let's say, a Barbara Walters, who was also interviewing people, but was a little more targeted in who she was interviewing. She did, of course, interview a lot of, I guess, less influential people, more entertainment based, but she was known as well as interviewing people that had the political power and the economic power. And she was known as a very, I don't want to say insightful interviewer, but someone that could be a little bit targeted, let's say. And so with someone like Joe Rogan, what is his intention, or any of these other podcasts that are out there? And if you look at Joe Rogan's website, the way he describes his podcast is long form interviews. That's it. He really isn't doing anything particular. And so whether you're getting good information or not is sort of the luck of who he has across, on the other side of the microphone.
I guess that's true. I guess that's true. But it's funny to compare it to Barbara Walters. I mean, she was interviewing Michael Jackson. I mean, she was interviewing all kinds of different people. I certainly was not a fan of Barbara Walters. But I don't see a big difference. In fact, I don't know. It's funny your takes on Joe Rogan. I think sometimes he has some crazy ideas. But last time you were talking about how biased he was, and now you're saying, maybe you're questioning his intent or something. I'm not sure. But, when we talk about bias, he does interview a ton of people, and he brings people on, and from all sides of the political spectrum. He brings on Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians, everybody, and he questions people pretty hard. I mean, and they're doing some research even while they're on their show. If Barry Weiss was on there, who worked for the New York Times for a while, and she was criticizing Tulsi Gabbard, and he said, well, I've had her on. She seems like a nice lady. Why do you say? And Barry was calling her a Russian asset or something like that. And he's like, well, why do you say that? And they were looking up where those claims were coming from. He does question people. It was interesting because we talked about Joe Rogan, and I mean, for me, I don't see his problem as being biased, or I don't know. And so we talked about that, and I didn't see the bias. But when we were talking about the mainstream media in general, and we talked about, for example, the Rand Paul story, and I said, well, geez, it was really hard to find, all the media seemed to be presenting that Rand Paul story from one perspective and not giving Rand Paul any opportunity to present his point of view. I said that to you. You said, no, I looked in the news stories. I Googled it, and it was pretty easy to find his opposing viewpoint. But when I pressed you on it, it was, well, I looked at, it was the third news story that you looked at, and it was way down in the article. I mean, that's a key piece of information that there two news stories didn't mention at all, and was deep in the article. But that didn't seem like very much, a big problem with bias to you. Whereas Joe Rogan, who brings on all political, people from all different viewpoints onto his show, but he was biased. And now we're saying, well, what's Joe Rogan's agenda? I mean, I think he enjoys what he does. He talks to a lot of people, and he tries to get at the truth. Now, at times, you and I both may agree that he doesn't get to the truth. I don't know. We could probably look at different things that he said over the years and criticize some things that he said. But I don't think bias is the biggest, or is a big problem with him. Am I missing something there?
Well, I found a list of some of his claims. He claimed that the mRNA vaccine, the Pfizer Moderna vaccine, is gene therapy. It isn't. Typically that would be a minor issue, except that we have such controversy around those particular vaccines. He also claimed 80% of people that were taking the Moderna vaccine had significant side effects, which is a gross exaggeration, not supported by any news. He claimed left-wing activists were setting forest fires in the Pacific Northwest.
Okay, but once again, I guess the bias is what we're looking for. Like I just conceded that, you can make those faces, but I just conceded that he makes outrageous claims at times. I just
want to get to the big one, the big claim that he made. He claimed we didn't land on the moon. He claimed we did not land on the moon.
I'd have to look into it and do some research and see exactly what was said and why he said it. You're probably right, but once again, you're proving a point that I've already conceded. He makes outrageous claims at times, but we're talking about bias. I mean, when he brings people on, I think he tries to get to the truth. Now, you might say, well, he makes like one thing is outrageous claims, another thing is, and so you're probably not going to go to Joe Rogan and get your news from him. I get it. But to say he's biased, and when I give you those two examples, like on the one hand, we have the mainstream media that you go and you're looking for a specific, what should be included in every article about Rand Paul that's being run on that story that he was trying to get money for the hurricane relief or whatever it was, the tornado relief in Kentucky. I mean, that should have been included in every story, and at the top or in the headline. Two of them didn't have it, and the one that finally did. I mean, like, that's a key part of the story. If you're going to level these accusations against him, then you should do two things. One, let him have his due or give his response. Two, go and validate it or invalidate it. Even when you looked at it, they didn't go back and say, but actually, he said this back in 2016. So, that isn't what he was saying back then. They could verify his story or invalidate it, but they didn't do that. They're not trying to get to the truth. Like, that's an example of bias. When Joe Rogan presents something, it's an outrageous claim, sure, but he allows people from all sides of those viewpoints to come in and fight him on it.
He doesn't. That's the problem. And this is the primary issue. And we've talked about bias in the mainstream media, and I do agree that it's there. I think that you and I maybe would disagree a little bit on the insidiousness of it. I think that everybody needs to be aware that there is bias, so that we go in with this mindset that what I'm reading, what's being presented to me may not be 100% accurate, and I'm going to need to do my own research. The problem with Joe Rogan is he gives the impression of getting all information. As I was doing a little bit of research, a really clever, description of his podcast was, it's what stupid people think a smart podcast is. That was their description of Joe Rogan. And I feel like that's really accurate, because he gives the impression that he's really trying to dig for the truth. He's not. He's just trying to have a good conversation. And it sounds like he's being, covering.
I think that's true. I agree 100% with that.
So
he's just trying to have a good conversation.
Yeah, exactly. But people take it as if he's done, weeks of research on these particular topics. Like the whole, right now we're going through the whole ivermectin controversy. That whether it was, and it's not. Of course, we've moved beyond the ivermectin itself. But the question about, the claim is Joe Rogan is spreading misinformation, which is going directly back to his claims that ivermectin is a viable treatment of the COVID-19. And now we're seeing all this coming through with some other people with the Spotify and everything else. But because he gives the illusion that he's presenting unbiased, well-researched information, people are stopping there. It's like the old claim, I've done my research, meaning I've listened to a Joe Rogan podcast.
Okay. Well, I don't know. It's funny because on it seems like you have different measurements for Joe Rogan on the mainstream media. I mean, on the mainstream media, we have and once again, I think you're conflating unbiased with well-researched, or biased with well-researched. Like, I'll agree, he's not the most well-researched, maybe because he's just reaching out. It's like you're going to your buddy's house and he's a bit of a conspiracy theorist, and he does know some stuff, but you take it with a grain of salt, which is how we should do it. But you say, when you're talking about the mainstream media, well, people should just realize that sometimes, there's going to be some bias in the mainstream media. They should do their research. But when we talk about Joe Rogan, well, people are just getting confused by him. They think he's well-researched, but he's not. I mean, you should judge them the same way. Yeah, people going to Joe Rogan, you're absolutely right, should realize it's not always the most well-researched show. Sometimes he has crackpots on there. Sometimes he's a bit of a crackpot. But we should do the same thing, and I agree. Yeah, we should understand that when we go there. I think he's got some interesting people on there. He's got some really interesting points. Sometimes if I don't watch the Joe Rogan podcast, it's 4 hours long. I wouldn't have time. But, sometimes something will come up, in YouTube or whatever, where I see a clip. Sometimes I think, oh my gosh, that is crazy. And other times I think, wow, that's a good point, and people really aren't talking about that. And I think he gets unfairly treated sometimes, like the ivermectin thing. Fine, we say that it's, first of all, there's plenty of research out there saying that ivermectin works. Second of all, the way they and when you look at it, one of the possible reasons why it works is an interesting one. It is used as a horse dewormer. The fact that they accused him of taking a horse dewormer is, in my mind, dishonest.
I agree.
And they should not be talking that way, because frankly, when they do that, the people on, and I'm talking about the mainstream media accusing him of taking horse dewormer, the people on, who kind of side or against Joe Rogan, or the more liberal people, they were saying, well, oh yeah, how stupid is he? That's terrible. It's horse dewormer. But anybody, we should be trying to convince each other. If it was truly providing the service that we need, which is they're giving us information in a way that helps us make our viewpoint and changes our mind at times. Because maybe we have this viewpoint and they can change our mind to say, oh, I should have seen it from a different perspective. I think that's a healthy thing. But when they do that, anybody that's opposed to them or siding with Joe Rogan, and they realize that's a lie, or Joe Rogan points that out to a lie, now you've alienated all those people. We're not convincing people or helping people to see different viewpoints when we do it in that way. Does that make any sense? So, he was not taking horse dewormer, because ivermectin is used both for horses and for people. But they don't give the same doses or the same type of medicine, the same type of ivermectin to horses as they do to people, And right. There are plenty of people. It is used as, I don't know if you want to say a dewormer, but there are people in other parts of the world that have parasites. And some of the studies that were done on ivermectin were done in those parts of the world, like India or Indonesia or something like that. And the idea or the thought that people were proposing was maybe those people that took ivermectin, they happened to have, they had COVID-19, they took ivermectin, but they also happened to have a parasite. It helped them with that parasite, which made them healthier, which helped them to overcome COVID-19. So there was, it was a time where we didn't really know all the medicines there hadn't been time yet to determine whether all these medicines were working. It wasn't a dangerous thing for him to take because it's prescribed to humans all the time. His doctors prescribed it to him. It actually made sense. Why not try it? But they made it seem like it was this horrible, stupid thing that he was doing. He was taking horse medicine. In fact, and you said he doesn't provide time for other viewpoints, but he had Sanjay Gupta from CNN on his podcast to talk about it and called them out for the lies that they were telling about him. So I think he does give different viewpoints. He is outrageous. I do agree, but anyway.
So I think one of the, criteria that we should be using as to whether something should be considered a reasonable news source, and acknowledging that it's nearly impossible to find unbiased, honest and accurate news out there in this world that we live in at the moment, and probably ever. We've never been able to have that sort of thing. So looking at whether you're talking mainstream media, bloggers, anybody, whose opinions should we be most willing, or whose information should we be most willing to listen to and take? And one of the better criteria that I've seen for assessing that is, how do they handle mistakes? How do they handle problems in their reporting? And I think that in all of the media, big, mainstream, minor, outside, whatever you want to call it, everybody is looking to hold people's attention. And so there's always a move towards sensationalism.
And negativity.
What's that?
And negativity.
And negative. Yes, I would agree. And yes, negativity is an easy way. I think that we as humans tend to gravitate towards the negative side of things, even though we always claim we want to hear the happy stories. You look at what people are watching, and we're drawn towards divisiveness. We want to slow down when we see the car accident. That's definitely the case. But when mistakes are made, how do they handle it? And do they have a retraction, or do they clarify the mistakes that they made, and where do they do that? Is it, if it's happening in a cable show, within that same, that same show, the next day or the next week, do they come clean and say, I said this thing, it was wrong, this is the facts? And some media outlets are better than others at doing that. For example, I mentioned that Joe Rogan had claimed that we didn't land on the moon. And he ended up going and addressing that because another guest on his show started pushing him on it. And so it brings up the question, would he have admitted his mistaken perspective if someone hadn't done it? And in that clarification that he did, he never actually said, I now believe we landed on the moon. He said, the evidence that I was using to say we didn't land on the moon wasn't clear evidence that we didn't. But he never actually said, he said, I was wrong in jumping to the conclusion, but the opposite conclusion is true. And so Joe Rogan doesn't have anyone on his staff or within his show that will take him to task, that will make him or require him, and he doesn't do it of himself, to put forth corrections. And this is a big problem, not just with him, with many of the podcasts and bloggers in general, and also the mainstream media too.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that you make. You accuse him of not bringing people with differing viewpoints on the show, but then you bring up an example of when he brought somebody with a differing viewpoint that called him out and made him change and helped him to change his opinion.
That was a 10-minute portion of an hour-and-a-half conversation. So it wasn't like he brought someone on to disagree with him. They had an hour-and-a-half conversation, and 10 minutes of that was a disagreement.
Yeah, I do think he certainly has disagreements on there. He brings people on he disagrees with. And, it is interesting he changed his viewpoint. But it just goes back to me, it goes back to the idea that he doesn't seem to be as biased as he is outrageous. He makes these outlandish claims and maybe not well researched. So totally agree. And you're right. We should be very careful about who we look to for news. That's why, for me, I don't look to Joe Rogan, but there's no way that I would look to the mainstream media for my news. I mean, a little bit, yes. Or for example, if I'm, when you brought up, a couple of weeks ago, that Rand Paul story, then I, like you said, I had to go really, if I'm going to look into the mainstream media, I have to really do a ton of research. I can't just read a story because I don't trust it. I have to go and start looking pretty deep. So where should we get it from? I think it's an interesting time. I do feel like there's this reaction to what's happening. People are realizing either a worsening or in the quality of the media that we're receiving, or maybe it's just maybe things have gotten worse. I did hear one theory that after a financial disaster like we had in 2008, which is like a once a century thing, you had the Great Depression and then that Great Recession, or whatever we actually ended up calling it, that there's a real divisiveness that can result, or that typically results in the country. And one theory as to why it happens is when things start to get better and they see the wealthy getting even wealthier, people get really, well, why isn't it, why am I still struggling? Why don't I have my job yet? And then there's this divisiveness in the country and people are throwing stones at the other side. But whatever, maybe, I don't know if the media, because the media, and I think media and politicians to some degree, it's hard to know if it's chicken or the egg, because I think media and politicians to some degree are, somebody said they're not organizing a parade. They're seeing the parade and they get to the front of it and start trying to lead the way. So I don't know if this divisive, they probably add to it, but to some degree, maybe it was happening and there's some grassroots or some movement that's happening where people are getting upset about things, and then politicians and media try to get out in front of it. But I don't know if things are getting worse, or they've just always been this way and we're now realizing it. But there's this reaction to it where now we do have these podcasts and these bloggers that give us another option, another choice, competition maybe, where we can start to see where or other options for where to get our news from. And if it's not Joe Rogan, yeah, we should look for people that are reasonable. Don't look for people that you always agree with, but maybe that can change your mind at times, and that are unbiased, that do issue corrections like you talked about before. that if you hear a news story, they're saying, here's the news story, not kind of presenting it in a way that makes it sound like, for example, we talked about the mainstream media stories covering the voting rights bills. And NPR and others were talking about it as if the Democrats were fighting for the right for blacks to vote and the Republicans were fighting to stop the blacks having the right to vote. They shouldn't be presenting it in that way. Even if you agree with that, they should say, here's the Democratic viewpoint, here's the Republican viewpoint. Here's, we're trying to tease out the truth in these stories, but presenting both sides of the issues and not just presenting one side or, trying to create a story that makes it sound like one side is right and one side is wrong.
Yeah, I think you're probably correct. And I'm going to say something, and I'm going to end this with a question to you, and I'm hoping you can help me to broaden my information input. Because you're right that at this point, when we look for our news, we're looking for the lesser of any evils. It kind of comes back to the whole the two-party system, the way that we vote, the lesser of evils, and we kind of get our news the same way, looking for the lesser of evils. In fact, when we were preparing to do this conversation, I began to do some research on news podcasts, people that were doing current events and news, and the only ones that I can find were the ones produced by existing news outlets. BBC and NPR and all the other. I couldn't find any other. That doesn't mean they aren't there. That just means that they aren't big enough to draw attention. Because one of the things that I have really struggled with and I've paid attention to in the last, 6 months or so, is trying to find a reasonable right-wing news source. I was getting newsletters from the National Review for a while. And I found myself having to stifle my verbal reaction to this stuff that was coming in, as the main editor there was always railing on the fact that the mainstream media wasn't covering the China virus well, the way they should have, and the lab leaks and all that. And finally, I stopped subscribing to them, and then I went to the Washington Examiner, and they do the same sort of the blowing up of really minor issues. Trying to, claiming that Biden's going to try to take all our guns, when in fact what Biden says is there was some shooting that happened and he said, we need to get some of these guns off the streets, which really isn't saying, Second Amendment people, go buy more guns because Biden's going to take them. But that's, and they printed that article, 3 days in a row. Because they know that there are so many people so many Second Amendment people that are on the right, and they're trying to, keep the information going, or people coming to their website. So, and then also with the voting rights bill, which you mentioned, when we had talked about it, I went looking for a perspective on the right, that one of the right-wing news media, and I couldn't find anybody talking about it. The only source I could find was the Wall Street Journal, and they've got a paywall up, so I couldn't even see what it was that they were saying. No one else on the right was even addressing this voting rights issue. So maybe the left media isn't showing the right's perspective, but the right media isn't showing the right's perspective either. So my question to you, Colin, is where can I go to get a moderate right-wing perspective on current events? Please tell me.
Well, it's interesting that it seems like you always put me in the box of right-wing.
Weird.
And I don't feel like I'm right-wing. I feel like I'm libertarian. And I agree with you. Like, I think the right-wing media is just as bad as the left-wing media. Like, I have the same question about the left-wing media. I mean, places I could kind of think of off the top of my head, maybe, the Wall Street Journal. I mean, maybe there's a paywall, but the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, the National Review, but they're going to be, and I don't even know, like, I don't read those myself, so I don't know how right-wing they are or anything, but did you think one of those wasn't?
I thought Atlantic would be left-wing, but you thought it was more right-wing?
I thought so, but I don't really follow them too much.
I'll look into it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some of those out there, but the difficulty that you're going to have with all of these media outlets is they are catering to a particular audience. It almost seems like we should stop. We think it is so important to get the news. We need to be up on current events. Well, listen to bloggers or podcasters that present thoughtful, reasonable opinions on what's happening in the world. And if you miss the fact that a hurricane happened somewhere, or a vote was lost someplace else, it won't be the most important thing. Your life probably isn't going to be any worse or better for knowing that stuff. Well, it won't be any worse for not knowing it. It may be worse for knowing it. So, because I think there's this idea that we have to be well informed. We have to read the news. I think we get enough of it out there, and the issues that become really important, if we're listening to thoughtful thinkers, we're probably going to get all that we need, because those very important issues will come to the fore. We'll hear about it from our friends, then we can go research it. I try to avoid, in general, reading that stuff because I think it's so crazy and so dishonest and so biased. When we were reading about Donald Trump, I think Donald Trump is not a great person, but I could have no opinion of him, or I could have so little. I felt so unsure of my opinion of him because anytime I read anything in the news media about him, it was so biased. It was so over the top on the one side and so over top the other direction on the other side. I had an opinion about why you didn't see anything on the Rand Paul story in Fox News, for example. I think Fox News is just biased the other way. And they thought, even though, to me, I think there's probably a decent explanation, at least the possibility of one. It seems like his explanation of, I just don't want to go over budget. We shouldn't be throwing all this money. He's a libertarian. He's a small government guy. So if there is a budget for how much we're going to spend on some disaster in some part of the world because of a hurricane, take the budget money from someplace else. That makes sense to me. Now, if that isn't truly what he said and he's misrepresenting it just to cover his tracks right now, then show me that. But it seems like there's a reasonable explanation. But if you're Fox News, how much good does it do you to point that out when it's going to be hard to convince people of that? Maybe they just said, I'll stay away from it because they're so biased in the other direction. They didn't want some, you know what I mean? Like, I think maybe that's a possibility. I don't know. All I know is I definitely saw the bias on the left side of the media.
Mm-hmm.
You're right. It was kind of weird. You're absolutely right. It was weird that the right wing wasn't coming out and saying, hey, look at this. There's a perfectly reasonable explanation and the left is twisting things. I thought that was weird. It doesn't bode well for Rand Paul. Maybe that's the reason why, but you're preaching to the choir if you're telling me that the right-wing media is being biased in this case. I think they're biased. I think they lie. I really do, just like the left wing does. I'm not a left-wing guy, I'm not a right-wing guy, and I think the media is doing a terrible job of presenting information to us. So my recommendation would be, don't go look for a right-wing media news source. Don't look for a left-wing media news source. Listen to thoughtful people, podcasts and bloggers that seem to be reasonable, that seem to bring a broad range of people on their show, and seem to, if they do misinterpret or make a mistake, that, as you said, that they are willing to correct it and say, hey, I made a mistake, and which neither side of the media is doing right now. And then you'll probably get enough news from that you'll be in a pretty good place. And then every once in a while, somebody will say, hey, can you believe that X happened? And if you feel like looking into it, then look into it like we did with Rand Paul, I just don't think there's good news media sources out there in the typical sense of that word. There's not a good source out there. I haven't found one. I can't find one.
Yeah, it seems like that you essentially summed up your perspective. So I'll follow with a little summation of my own, which is that in many ways I agree with you. I do feel that the bias is worse on the right, in the sense that their bias usually manifests in silence. Meaning that when there's an issue that comes up, that many issues they don't cover at all. That like the Rand Paul, like the Voting Rights Act, and so if you were to go to look at what it is that they're doing, you might see certain amounts of bias. But I think sometimes what they're not doing illustrates even greater bias. I'm not saying that the bias on the left is inconsequential or that it should be ignored. I think that there are many of the people. I feel like that the outlets are not doing a good enough job of managing their people in the bias that they're manifesting. I feel like that if the outlets really had an interest in presenting a well-balanced story of any kind, that they should do a better job of managing the people that are presenting the story. And I think that, and I agree with you that no matter where you're getting your news from, whether it's from the mainstream or some of these alternative people, or some of the the people that are putting out long format conversations or personal investigations, I think that we always need to be looking at it with looking for the bias, because if you're not looking for it, you're not going to see it. And so being aware that bias does exist so that we can try and catch it, and then perhaps do our own investigation to find an alternative perspective. I don't agree with you on the fact that we shouldn't be paying attention to what's going on in the world. And this, I guess, could lead, I wanted to look forward to our next conversation, and I had thought, and I'm open to your opinion on it, that we can take a look at current events and use the basis of what's going on right now between Russia and Ukraine, how they're, the Russia is massing soldiers and weaponry on their border. And the rumor is that they're going to be, or there's the possibility of them invading the Ukraine, and that the Russia is using this to negotiate. And I thought it would be interesting to look at America's role in the global environment. With that in particular, do we, as a nation, should we have some sort of responsibility? Should we, whether it's leading the negotiations, threatening in involvement or intervention, just looking at what America's role is in the world, if that's of interest to you. What do you think?
Sounds like a lot of research.
Well, I mean, if we use that particular event and then just look at the more broader abstract idea.
Yeah, I don't say it sounds like a lot of research, so I don't want to do it. It just sounds daunting, but like a homework assignment. But no, but that would be an interesting one. Let's do it. I do want to do that. One we should think about in the future is, and I don't know, maybe we should just let these kind of. Well, this one didn't really come out organically. But yeah, maybe one we could look at in the future after that would be overcoming poverty, like the best way to overcome poverty.
Yeah, I'm down with that. That sounds good.
Because I think oftentimes, I get painted in the right wing, or libertarians too, I guess, the same way that, hey, you don't care about poor people, you're heartless, thoughtless, mean people. And we should talk about the best way to overcome poverty and help people in those disadvantaged situations. But yeah, I like the foreign policy one too. Let's do that one first.
Okay. All right, cool. Yeah, that was, I feel like that was a good conversation. I enjoyed that.
Yeah.
We hope you learned something in this episode of Brother versus Brother, a podcast about difficult conversations. We also hope that you enjoyed it enough to subscribe to the podcast. You can help us by spreading the word. Share this episode on your favorite social media so that others will have an opportunity to experience it as well. You can also support us by donating through Patreon. This information and more can be found on our website, broconvo.com, and on our various social media accounts. Thank you.